called A Profiling Evil Live. Thanks so much for being with us. Folks are starting to stream in. Tonight, we're talking about Chad Doerman, that horrible homicide case that occurred over in Ohio. And I've got a couple of amazing guests with me tonight, and we're going to just bring them in right away. First, I want to bring in Dr. Joni Johnston and then Adam Burke, who is a lawyer in Ohio. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you both here. And I want to just shout out. Now, people are starting to pile into the room here. And folks, we're going to allow you to ask questions as we go through the night. I want to just say thanks to the mods who are watching over things here and keeping us on track. And to all of you for taking time out tonight to talk about this. This is kind of a heavy subject. And, you know, even I'll tell you from a police officer's perspective, even for an officer going to a crime scene like this pays a heavy toll. And too often officers are looking at the crime scene. They're looking at the age of these children and they're associating it with their own little ones that are at home or the pressures that they're feeling in life. But it doesn't change for the psychologists who have to deal with this. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Or for the lawyers and the court officers that have to deal with this. Everyone is impacted, and frankly, there are just no winners in any of this. But I want to start right off by just introducing who we've got with us tonight. First, we've got Dr. Joni Johnston, and Joni is a clinical and forensic psychologist who's also a licensed investigator. Joni, I think that's so cool because you don't see that happen very often. So, but 30 years of experience, and I just learned something today that I guess I didn't put two and two together. You and I have been on court TV a bunch of times together, but I just saw that you also are connected to the Cold Case Foundation. I don't know if you knew, but I was actually one of the original board members with Greg and John Douglas in the initial phases for about the first 5 years of the Cold Case Foundation. I
didn't know that. Yeah, I really enjoyed volunteering for that organization. It's fantastic.
Well, they're great. And I'd like you to just take 1 second and tell everybody you've got a number of books that are out there. And folks, Joni also has, you can find her online. You can find her constantly with articles in Psychology Today. The reason we connected on this was because of a pretty powerful article you wrote just a couple of days ago in a blog, Joni, that really touched me on the Doerman case. But you've also written a number of books. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Probably the most recent book I've written, the most recent book I have written is called Serial Killers, 101 Questions True Crime Fans Asked. I've also wrote I don't know if you remember the Complete Idiot's Guides that came out several years ago, the Complete Idiot's Guide to laundering, whatever. I wrote The Complete Idiot's Guide to Psychology, which is a really, really fun book because I really like talking about psychology and forensic psychology to kind of the general public. And so it really gave me an opportunity to think about what would I want to know if I was going back and just starting in college again. So that was a really fun book to write. And the serial killer one was really interesting because I collected questions from people who read my Psychology Today blog over about 7 years. And so that really became the structure of that book. And so it made it really easy for me. I was very lucky to have such a great audience that had all these questions over the years. Most of them I knew the answers to, some of them I didn't. So it was a great opportunity for me during COVID, especially, to take some time and really make sure I understood all the things that I've been talking about for so long.
That is awesome. And I assume that they can find these on Amazon and also by just going to jonijohnston.com.
Absolutely.
Well, folks, make sure you're doing that. And then let's introduce and welcome Adam Burke, who's a lawyer in Ohio. His primary practice is in the Columbus area. We had kind of fun talking about Columbus before the call started. Is not only a lawyer who excelled academically, but this guy has excelled in the profession. And, Adam, I always think it's pretty cool to call out the fact that not only are you licensed to practice in the state of Ohio, and in the district Supreme Court in Ohio, but you're also licensed to practice in front of the United States Supreme Court. And I think that's pretty darn cool. But tell everybody just a little bit about your background and how interesting it is to be a defense attorney by trade.
Well, thanks a lot, Mike, for having me. I am a defense attorney for the past 15 years. That's been something that I kind of stumbled into. It wasn't, we were kind of talking before the show that probably before I went to law school, I was more prosecution minded and kind of saw things as a little more black and white, and there's good guys and bad guys. And I just happened to, in law school, work for a criminal defense attorney and really got a different perspective on what that profession is about. And I really saw that most fortunately, most of the people that defense attorneys have an effect on in terms of their representation, their practice, are not the Doermans of the world. A lot of these people are everyday people that have found themselves in a bad spot for whatever reason, and are really needing help to try to get their lives back on track and trying to get a second chance in many cases. And so it's just been a very rewarding career path, and there's just never any shortage of interesting subject matter to really deal with all day long. There's never a dull moment. So,
well, I think all of us would agree. We would hate to be judged on things we did 20 years ago, and hopefully today we're better people than we are then. The thing that I have always appreciated so much about the defense bar, quite frankly, Adam, is that number one, I don't want to see cases overturned. I don't want to see things taken back and redone. And people deserve to be protected. Now, this is a really interesting case that has got a lot of emotion built around it. And frankly, when I finish this little intro, I want to ask both of you a quick question. But just a few days ago, a 32-year-old father named Chad Doerman shot his children. Started out with him shooting a little 4-year-old son, a boy named Hunter. He shot this child 2 times, and there's been lots of discussion. And folks, we're not going to go into the gruesome details of all that happened, but he murdered his son. His 7-year-old son, the oldest boy in the family, took off running, trying to flee once he realized what was going on. And he was shot in the back as he fled from the home. And his father then went out and shot him again, killing him. Then the one that has really upset a lot of people has been the fact that this little 3-year-old Chase, who was pulled from his mother's arms and then murdered in front of her. And of course, at that time, she was also injured. And this thing has brought up a lot of heartache and pain everywhere. So, Joni, I guess I was really touched by your article a few days ago when you talked about this case. Why don't you maybe share how this impacts you? Because you're dealing with criminals every single day in the California correction system. You have been doing forensic psychology for 30 years. This isn't new, and yet it still impacts you as a human being.
It does. And I've been very lucky. Adam was mentioning that he started out kind of with a prosecution mindset and then became a criminal defense attorney. And I have to say that I've been very lucky to work a lot with victims and victims' rights, as well as with offenders. I started out working with victims and then started working in the correctional system. And I really value that because it's helped me to see, I guess, the whole situation. And I would certainly agree that most of the people that I evaluate, that I talk to, have not committed crimes to this level. And I don't know if it was that it really wasn't that, because I've talked to many people who've murdered other people and done horrific things. I think it was these just children, there was just the pictures were so full of life. And you can see, or I could see the bond between these little boys, and they just seemed so happy. And they seemed so bonded to each other. They seemed just full of life. And so I found myself just looking at these pictures and different pictures over and over again. And I really did have an emotional impact. And I think it's touched many, many people to think about a crime that is so difficult to understand or to try to explain, because I'm also a mom. And I put myself in the shoes of a mom or a parent. And I've certainly, we've all had, moments of being angry at our children or angry at our spouse. And yet the thing that we witnessed or that we've heard about on June the 15th, it just seems like at a whole nother level.
Yeah, this was a tough one.
Mm-hmm.
Adam, You've been defending people who've made mistakes and people who have chosen to make terrible decisions. How did this thing impact you?
I'm a father in addition to being an attorney. So I have a 10-year-old daughter, and it's really hard for me. Even though I'm used to seeing some pretty difficult cases, it's hard for me to get my mind around how a father can get to that place. My thoughts about my own daughter are, my first instinct, she's 10 years old, is to want to protect her. As Joni was saying, or Dr. Johnston was saying, certainly we all have had those moments as parents where we're kids are kind of testing our limits. But the level of depravity to kill your own children is really hard to get your mind around. And so, as a father, as a human being, it's a really difficult thing to understand.
This is a tough one, and frankly, I think it's a great segue to talk a little bit about the law in this regard, Adam, because people are filling up the chat box right now with discussions about how does someone like this plead not guilty when they've confessed, and of course we're using we're relying on the word of the prosecutor and others to say that he has in fact confessed. And I wanted to put up this little note here that there's going to be some virtual memorial services and other things if people feel like they want to kind of check in and see what's going on there. But let me just throw out a question to you, and that is, help us better understand Ohio's homicide statutes and what we could expect from the prosecution and the defense in this case, especially given Attorney General Yost's push in March to get rid of the death penalty.
Sure. And one thing, Mike, if you don't mind, before I address the question on the screen there, you mentioned the comments about how can he plead not guilty when he's already confessed. And I think it's a really good question. A lot of my clients kind of have that question. Well, can we really get away with a not guilty? And I think what it's important for your viewers to understand is that when you enter a plea of not guilty, that's almost everyone that is in the criminal justice system that's facing charges is going to enter a not guilty plea. And it's not necessarily saying that you didn't do it. And what every person, including Chad Foreman, is entitled to under the Constitution is a presumption of innocence. And so even when somebody appears to be clearly guilty, what you do with a not guilty plea, when you enter a not guilty plea, is you're really exercising your constitutional presumption of innocence. And in fact, for somebody in Mr. Foreman's position, I've been in courtrooms where defendants will actually try to enter a guilty plea, especially on a felony case. Most judges wouldn't accept a guilty plea at this stage of the case because there's so many procedural protections built into our system that, and it's not just about Foreman, it's about all of us. It's part of what keeps our society free, is to have these constitutional protections that are built in. And so the seriousness of the charge and the seriousness of the possible penalty really does require a very methodical, careful approach from the court system. And so a not guilty plea is just a starting point, and it's very unlikely, and we'll get to the statutes on this, that he would actually be found not guilty. But with respect to the core charge of what Mr. Foreman is charged with is aggravated murder. And aggravated murder is a premeditated murder. There's other subcategories of aggravated murder, but the aggravated part means that it's murder, but it's made worse. So it's aggravating. There are aggravating circumstances that make it worse than an unplanned or unpremeditated murder. Now, Ohio calls that premeditation component prior calculation and design. So it's one of the things that the prosecutor is going to have to be able to prove, although they've filed a number of counts against Mr. Foreman. And so a lot of these counts, I believe there's 31, are probably going to be things that are charged in the alternative. So one of the ways of proving aggravated murder, which is one of the ways that you get to the death penalty, is through showing up that there was a prior calculation or a plan, which my understanding is that that's the allegation against Mr. Foreman. But also aggravated murder includes murder of a child under 13, and here we have 3 of them. So there are a number of ways for the prosecutor in this case to get to the ultimate penalty, which they're pursuing, which is the death penalty. From the defense side, the defense kind of has 2 different approaches. I'd expect them to probably try a couple different ways of defending Mr. Foreman. One would be to try to defend the guilt or innocence phase. So is he guilty or not, which seems pretty obvious at this point that he's done what he's charged with. But, you know, the defense attorneys are going to look at the possibility of a defense of insanity, not guilty by reason of insanity, which Dr. Johnston will be addressing later on in the show. But I also think that they will look at ways of attacking the evidence. As a practical matter, that's probably more of a way to sort of slow down the case than actually be successful in challenging his guilt or innocence. He's made a confession, but one thing that a defense attorney can do is to try to challenge the admissibility of the confession. It's hard to do. It's unlikely to succeed, but there's a suppression motion that his team could file as one way to defend him. But go ahead with that.
Yeah. So let me ask something, Joni. Help me understand the insanity plea from a clinical perspective, and then Adam, if you could kind of weigh in on the insanity plea. For instance, we've been talking a lot about the murder cases out in Idaho. Idaho doesn't allow insanity to be a plea. You're either deemed competent to be a part of this or you're not. And so it doesn't move forward. Joni, what are your thoughts?
So just a quick clarification, the last thing that you said, because these things get so confused oftentimes. So there's a difference between competency and insanity. So, for example, in the Lori Vallow B.O.L.O case, she was found incompetent to stand trial, and she did not offer an insanity plea, which, of course, Idaho doesn't allow it. But even if they had, I don't think she would have wanted to go that route. But competency just means you're able to basically participate in your own defense, to understand the charges against you, understand the rules of the courtroom, and assist your counsel. And then, of course, insanity means, it's a legal term, means that the person at the time of the crime was either, depending on the state, didn't know what was right from wrong, and you have to show that, or they couldn't appreciate that what they were doing was right or wrong. And you kind of go, well, what does that mean? Aren't they the same thing? Well, not necessarily. So for example, let's say that I had some kind of delusion that there were going to be a series of earthquakes, catastrophic earthquakes, if I did not, kill these certain people that I thought were plotting these catastrophic earthquakes. And I genuinely believe that. I had a mental health history. I had a prior diagnosis. I was on antipsychotic medication. So I had all those things. And I developed this belief. And I really believe that unless I went after these people, they were going to essentially destroy the world. I might know that the average policeman or policewoman would arrest me if they saw me carrying a gun, going into this home to kill the bad guys, basically. But it's possible that I might be thinking of myself either as acting in self-defense, protecting myself, or as a hero. And in that situation, I might know that legally that's wrong, but, morally, right, I'm doing the right thing. A couple of years ago, I had I guess it was more than a couple of years ago now, I'm dating myself. I had actually evaluated a young man. It was right after 9/11, and he had a severe mental illness, and he was not taking his medication, and he was driving down the road, and he all of a sudden heard this voice that said, this driver next to you is going to blow up the San Diego airport. He's going to hijack some planes, and he's going to blow up the San Diego airport, just like had happened. I mean, not the airport, but the planes have been hijacked. And so this person who's driving down the road sees this person, believes this is going to happen, and runs this person off the road, and then proceeds to ram his car into their car. And luckily, that was as bad as it got. But this person didn't try to get away. This person literally was trying to hold the car there, called 911, said there's a terrorist who I've got him. Again, all the information supported this delusion. He acted like he was a hero. He was literally thinking of himself as a kind of a helper to law enforcement. He's keeping this person there until law enforcement gets there. This poor person in the car, you can imagine, was scared beyond belief. But there's an example, I think, of a situation where this person did successfully plead, and actually there was no contest. Both the defense and the prosecutor said, yes, we are convinced that this person was acting under this delusion. And so both sides accepted, well, the prosecutor, accepted an insanity plea.
So let me ask you, Adam, with that idea, is it a responsibility of the defense to fully vet in a case like this the competency and the sanity of an individual? And it's something that always frustrates the public when they hear that there's this plea coming through, and yet isn't it one of those things that kind of keeps us from having this thing turned over at some point?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that, we fully should expect in this case is there's going to be an appeal at some point. And one of the frequent issues in an appeal is whether or not Mr. Doerman was effectively represented by counsel. And so what a lot of people that are frustrated with some of the what they perceive maybe as being antics of the defense in a case like this are actually part of his fundamental constitutional rights. And if a defense attorney is not doing everything that he can to represent his clients, including exploring things like competency and the possibility of a not guilty by reason of insanity defense, then the case could actually be reversed on appeal for ineffective assistance of his attorney. So in some ways, the attorney doing his job the way he's supposed to be, or she is supposed to be, is a guardrail against a future appeal or a future reversal on appeal.
So does this guy have a public defender, Adam? And with the state suggesting they're going to move toward this being a capital case, then he's going to get more financial support from the state and a lawyer that has actually been proven in the courts in death penalty cases and others. Can you kind of walk through that so people understand that?
Sure. Yeah. On most death penalty cases, there's going to be at least two lawyers. At least one of the lawyers has to be what's called learned counsel, which is an attorney that has experience in trying death penalty cases. So he's going to have at least one lawyer that has that background and experience, possibly two, but he's almost always going to have two lawyers at a minimum assigned to his case. I haven't looked to see if he's retained counsel, but the vast majority of death penalty cases are court appointed, either a public defender's office or a private lawyer that's been appointed by the court to represent the accused in a death penalty case.
So let's assume this is your case, Adam, and you need to have that psych evaluation done, and you call Dr. Johnston. What's that conversation sounding like between the two of you?
Well, I mean, as a practical matter, it's the process is usually there's a motion that's filed for a competency evaluation, and then there's a formal not guilty plea, a written plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. And at least the way that's done in Ohio is I wouldn't actually have that conversation directly with the evaluating psychologist, but I have in certain circumstances talked with psychologists, because sometimes, and I would expect in this case, there would be a need for an independent evaluation, because most of these, as I'm sure Dr. Johnston will tell you, most of these evaluations come back that the defendant is competent and that the defense or the defense of not guilty by reason of insanity is not applicable. And so if I were to talk to a private expert like Ms. Johnson or Dr. Johnson in this case, my conversation would be probably to talk to her about what I've observed in my interactions with my client. And so I've certainly had clients that there's no doubt in my mind that they're incompetent, if they're psychotic, if they're, I can't interact with them in the way that you and I, the three of us, are interacting, because he's convinced that I'm trying to kill him, or his brother that's retained me is trying to kill him, and sometimes we're interrupted by screaming. That's something I'm going to let the psychologists that are dealing with my client be aware of, that this really does appear to be a genuine case of mental illness that deserves professional intervention.
Yeah. So, Joni, with the emotion that you feel when you see a case like this, and then that call comes from the defense bar to look and potentially professionally share information that could minimize the kind of penalties someone like this might face. Tell me as a professional what kind of emotions you're going through and how you push those aside and just do your job.
It really is like wearing a different hat. So I have to say that if there was ever a case, and this could be one, where if somebody called me up, if Adam called me up and I felt like I just had such intense emotions about this case that I was concerned that they might interfere with my ability to adequately and effectively evaluate him or objectively evaluate him, I would decline that case. And it really has never happened because, people are human beings at the end of the day. And my job is very clear. So Adam calls me up and he tells me what he's observing, that his client is screaming or whatever in the meetings or those kinds of things. And so I'm going to take note of that. I'm going to write all that stuff down, and I'm going to rely on a bunch of different sources. I think one of the myths people have oftentimes is, well, somebody can fool you. And let me tell you, somebody probably could fool me in 2 hours or a day. But it's important to realize that, as a forensic psychologist, one of the differences between forensic psychologist and clinical psychologist is it matters if they're telling the truth or not. And of course, it matters in therapy, but not as much, because if somebody comes in and they're lying to me in therapy, that's a therapeutic issue. So I may or may not confront that person. I may not even know it because I'm just taking that person's word at face value. When I'm doing an evaluation for an insanity plea, I'm going to be seeing police records. I'm going to be seeing what witnesses said. I'm going to be seeing what the person said to the police officer when they arrested him. I'm going to be seeing all of their mental health records, if they have any, or their medical records. I'm going to be seeing what kind of medication they've been on, if they've ever had any history of mental health. It's very rare for somebody to be, legally sane, not have a psychiatric history, not have a diagnosis of some kind of severe mental illness, all of a sudden commit a horrific crime, and then be legally insane. So people who successfully meet that criteria, and as Adam pointed out, it's very few who meet that because the bar is so high to meet that. They're typically people who have been in psychiatric hospitals, who've been on medication, who've had struggles with their severe mental health disorders, have specific symptoms. We know that it's not the diagnosis, it's the symptoms. So they're more likely to have, for example, command auditory hallucinations, voices that are telling them to do something, or they're more likely to have paranoid delusions. They think somebody's out to get them, and so they're acting in self-defense. So we have to look at all of that. I'm going to be talking to custody officers in that jail and see what that person is like. I may listen to their phone calls that they're having outside the jail. So I'm going to be looking at all that information because it's not hard to fake things for a period of time, but it's very difficult, to plan out a few years beforehand and put that into motion and continue that, right? And then after the fact, continue that successfully just to get an insanity plea.
Yeah. So, Adam, here's the old chief of staff in the AG's office mindset. Tell me, has public opinion changed, and will the Ohio legislature view the death penalty differently after an event like this than they did 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I think that the issues with the death penalty and because Ohio is a very conservative state. I think in general there's been some pretty strong support for the death penalty, but Ohio has had some very specific problems with botched executions and some pretty gruesome results in the process of attempting to execute inmates and prisoners that are subject to this penalty. So, certainly if there are advocates of the death penalty, this would be the Mr. Doerman would be the poster child for that continued offense. But I think one of the issues with the death penalty is that it's an expensive process for the taxpayer, and the actual ultimate execution of the penalty is problematic, because there are only a certain number of drugs that can be approved for that purpose, and they're not always effective at ending the life of the convicted person facing that penalty in a way that's not gruesome. So, how that will wind up ultimately, and how this case may factor into that, I really can't say at this point, but I think time will tell.
Dr. Johnston, the other day I spoke to a family member who had waited 25 years before someone was finally executed on a criminal case where they murdered this individual's family member. And I remember the response was, I almost would prefer life without parole, because then it's final and it's over. And, and of course we can get into arguments about what is life without parole. Is it really life, or is it just 20 years and then maybe you're going to get out? But what's the psychology behind the mindset of that? And is it different for different families about where they want to be?
It absolutely is. And one of the things that I found, which was initially a surprise to me, is that I think those beliefs and those choices around the death penalty, or the kind of the feelings about it, I think have a lot more to do with maybe the values and beliefs of the individual families than they do, for example, the nature of the crime. Because, I've met families who had lost a child, lost a spouse, a sister, a brother, in the most horrendous circumstances. And for this particular family, or this particular spouse or mom, their journey was forgiveness for whatever reason. And then you have another family who've had similar circumstances, and their journey for healing was sitting on the front row and watching that person be executed. And I can understand both sides of that. I feel like I could have my own views or opinions about the death penalty. I feel like until I have been in this family member's shoes and lost that particular loved one, I'm not in a position to judge what is right. They know what is right for their family in terms of what they need to heal and move forward.
Yeah. And I really think that's important. As you were talking, I was having flashbacks to capital cases that attorneys that I worked for in the prosecutor's office and at the attorney general managed and handled appeals on. Adam, one of the things I found kind of interesting, and I think it was a little bit of an elbow jerk, Dr. Johnston, but the prosecution came out swinging of, we're going after the death penalty. And I wonder how much consultation was done with family before that statement was made and other kinds of things. What are your thoughts on that, Adam? And where our responsibility as court officers, or where your responsibilities as court officers lies in regard to the death penalty pursuit?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question to answer. And I certainly I don't think I can fault the prosecutors in this case for taking that approach. I mean, there's the human side of the parent in me that says that's exactly the right thing to say. But I will say, and this is maybe the more cynical side, is that at least in Ohio, prosecutors are politicians. They are elected, and I think they're also concerned with the public. How does the public view their statements? Are they strong enough? Is it because? And I think that prosecutors I know are genuinely concerned about that, as are judges, because judges in Ohio are elected. And so I've had cases, high profile cases where if there's a camera in the courtroom, you can bet the bonds are going to go up. The rhetoric is from the prosecutor is going to go up. But in this case, I really can't fault the prosecutors in this case for saying we're seeking the death penalty. I think if there's ever a case that would call for it, a father executing his 3 children would certainly fall into that category. Now, there are lots of cases that start off as if they appear to be headed for that direction, and the prosecutors change their mind after someone like Dr. Johnston has a chance to really dig into the mental health and the circumstances of the mind of that defendant. So, it's easy for me to kind of Sunday morning or Monday morning quarterback the prosecutor and their public comments, but I think it's understandable why they'd be making those in this case.
Yeah, well, this is actually a perfect segue into the next question, Dr. Johnston, that I think I'd like to have you talk about is what motivates a mom or a dad. And statistically, the numbers are not that far from each other from what I've been able to research over my career. What motivates them to kill their kids?
Well, you're absolutely right on a couple of different levels, Mike. One is, now, first of all, it's rare. It's not common for a parent to kill a child. So let's get that out there right away. And you're right. What's interesting about that is when you look at the research, so much of the research is on mothers who killed their children. And I think when I first started looking into that, which was years ago, I assumed that mothers were the ones who killed their children. And in fact, that's not true. It's about 50-50. And you can find different, I think, ages that are skewed one way or the other. So for example, infanticide, which is killing a child shortly after birth, mothers are much more likely to do that. When you think about it, that kind of makes sense because they're the ones who are there and they're the ones who just gave birth. But overall, the statistics are pretty even. And so in terms of looking at what are the motivations that, for parents to commit filicide or to kill a child of their own, back in 1969, so this is not, even though it's a relatively rare phenomenon, unfortunately, it isn't a new one. Dr. Philip Resnick, who's kind of been the pioneer in this area, looked worldwide at situations where parents had killed children and pretty much decided on like 5 different categories or motives that he found in parents. One was kind of this revenge, which is not a common motive. But it certainly is there. One is psychosis. So a person, I mentioned a couple of examples earlier, potentially, if, for example, somebody thought that God was testing them like he tested Abraham. And one of the tests was, would you be willing to kill your child for me? There's an example of somebody who's experiencing a religious delusion and who acts under that. That might be an example of somebody who kills a child when they're experiencing psychotic symptoms. Then there's the unwanted child. A parent kills a child because they didn't really want that child. It's kind of an inconvenience. And so they get rid of them. And then there's, this is probably the one that we see the most. And this is kind of like, almost by accident, is fatal maltreatment. In other words, it's a parent who's already physically abusive or physically neglectful, and they're not necessarily intending to murder that child or kill that child, but the abuse or the neglect becomes so severe that the child dies. And then the last one is another relatively unusual one. And I think it's really misnamed. I don't like this name, but I didn't give it this name. So it's kind of called the altruistic motive, which I think is really a misnomer. And I think in this category, what Dr. Resnick was describing is a parent who is often either suicidal or severely depressed, and their thinking is distorted. They may have severe financial problems, and they convince themselves that this child is better off dying or coming to heaven with me than staying in this horrible earth or living here without me. And so therefore that's their motive. And so those are the 5 main reasons that parents are likely to kill a child.
That's a lot to wrap your head around. And Adam, I'm going to have you put your defense hat on for a second here, or leave it on, and say, as if you have worked through the psychological side of this, and this individual is sane and competent to stand trial, and these are your choices, still doesn't make killing a child legal. How do you defend that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think ultimately where this case is going to lead. Now, this is an educated guess, and just statistically, odds are that he's unlikely to be found to be not guilty by reason of insanity. And so at some point, his attorneys are likely to transition from the guilt or innocence question and focus their defense on what's called a mitigation defense. And that really has less to do with whether or not he's guilty, but are there factors in this individual's background that would not excuse in any way, and it's hard to imagine that there's any excuse other than the type of insanity defense we've been talking about, but are there factors in this person's background that put into perspective how he became the monster that he appears to be? And so that can be, some ritualistic, horrific abuse that he's experienced in his childhood. It can be a lot of different factors. And what a lot of defense attorneys, in fact, I think most capital defense attorneys will do is actually hire a mitigation expert whose their only job is to dig into the person's family history, their childhood, really every facet, every aspect of that person's life to understand what led to this, what was going on in this person's life and mind that would make it possible for him to commit such a horrible act. And then at some point, if we assume that he's found guilty of aggravated murder and the question is turned over to a jury, which is in Ohio, that's how that would work. There'd be a sentencing phase, and the jury would have to be required to weigh the aggravating circumstances, including this horrific crime, against what are the mitigating circumstances that maybe certainly can never excuse what happened, but maybe put that into some perspective about what was going on in this individual's life and background that could have possibly made this seem like this was the best choice for him to murder his own children.
Oh boy. So Dr. Johnston, this brings up a question that I've often thought about. I'm reflecting back on listening to a family psychologist speaking about the dynamics and the differences between, in many cases, husbands and wives or men and women. And I remember the psychologist saying it's really important that when a child crashes on their bicycle that they have a parent, and I'm not going to assign it to one or the other, but a parent who will come out and say, get up, you're okay, rub some dirt in it and try again. At the same time, to have another parent who asks, are you okay? And so kind of with that thought, what's the difference between moms and dads in these kinds of crises?
So when you say these kinds of crises, you're talking about, I'm assuming, not the bicycle accident. You're talking about
not the bicycle accident. Yeah, let's talk about a dad killing 3 children. Thank you.
So, so let me just make sure I understand the question, because I'd love to do my best at answering it. So in terms of responding to what has happened, is that what you mean? Or in terms of the motivation for doing what happened?
I think, I don't know that I actually know my own question,
Okay.
other than I know that at times my wife and I will look at each other like we're on 2 different planets with our mindset. We've never done anything violent, but now we have situations where that is happening. I don't know. Maybe you can bring all that together. Or tell me that's a stupid question and let's move on to something.
No, it's not. I just want to make sure. I didn't want to answer the wrong question, so I just was trying to kind of clarify that. I mean, I would say, this will probably say something about my background, that it would be great, ideally, I don't think this happens very often, to have either parent be able to say both of those, to say, you're okay, rub some dirt on it. And are you okay first, right? Are you okay first? And you're going to be fine. Rub some dirt on it or whatever. And I think, at the same time, I do think it's very important for children to have models. I mean, one of the things I learned so early on in my work in evaluating offenders and treating offenders was, I used to go in and we have to do this kind of, this form and fill out and ask about family background and childhood, and et cetera. And I would say, oh, is there a history of physical abuse, or do you have a history of sexual abuse? And so often it'd be no. And then later in the conversation, they'd be talking about something else. And then this just horrendous history would come up. And it became clear to me that, our idea of what is abusive, particularly as children, we learn from our parents and the people, our caretakers. And so I learned that I had to ask about very specific behaviors and very specific feelings, because some people, even as adults, didn't really understand what might be abusive or abuse. And so I think, it's hard to really overestimate, I think, the impact that we have as parents, and not just as parents, but, I think for children, because I have seen children who came from just horrific backgrounds, trauma, poverty, dangerous neighborhood, et cetera. And if they had one person in their life, one person, it could be an extended family member, it could be a friend, it could be a minister, it could be one person, it seemed to make all the difference. But I think it's difficult to overestimate what an impact that has on children growing up in so many ways that are not even obvious. How we see the world, how we cope, how we respond to things that upset us, how we manage our anger. Just so many things, not, how we think dad should be, how we think husbands should be, how we think wives should be. All those things just get all wrapped in, and they are things that we don't even think about until we're faced maybe sometimes with another role model. We kind of go, oh, not everybody's like this, right? Not every family's like my family.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, if we were to go with the direction this case appears to be going, that some of the information coming out from the prosecutor in the courtroom was that Doerman has indicated that he was planning this for months. That's a pretty tall mountain to overcome, isn't it, counselor? And I'm talking about the legal counselor on this particular question, because then I think I have a question for you, Joni, about that.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly difficult hurdle to clear. And the only defense if that he's going to have in terms of trying to beat that evidence back would be to try to suppress his statement. And so one of the tools in the tool bag for a defense attorney is to argue that, and for some reason, the statement was taken against his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, that perhaps his will was overcome by the officers interrogating him, or that in some way the Miranda advisement that officers used was deficient in some way. Those motions are very difficult to win. And a lot of times defense attorneys don't necessarily file those motions with the expectation that they're going to win, but it just puts an obstacle in the path of a conviction. But that's really going to be one of his only avenues for trying to beat back that type of evidence, short of the insanity defense that we've been talking about.
Yeah, thank you. So, Dr. Johnston, I was way outside of my swim lane on a video I did a couple of nights ago, where I talked about some of the behavioral characteristics of moms and dads that kill their children. And I kind of found myself gravitating toward revenge being a reason in this particular case. But I wondered if you could maybe help us with this next question that I have for you, which is, how often is revenge a motive? And is it too early to start theorizing?
Well, I can probably answer the first question better than the second one. So we know, I think, at about 12%, this one study I'm thinking about, that was a 2022, so pretty recent study that looked at several filicides in parents. About 12% of the time for dads, it was part or all the motive, and for about 4% of the moms. So it's a relatively rare or uncommon motive. And when it occurs, it tends to occur in a couple of different circumstances. So one is if there's some kind of ugly custody dispute, is oftentimes a precipitant. If there's some infidelity, if there is rejection and arguments which of course this should not be a surprise to anybody, right? So there's conflict in the relationship. And when there's this kind of interpersonal conflict, and it's particularly when there's some rejection or separation or perceived, betrayal, and again, sometimes we see certain personality characteristics like narcissism, poor ability to kind of control emotions, somebody who's very controlling as a person. So there's a bunch of different things in the mix. It's not just, if a person finds out that their spouse is unfaithful, therefore they go out and kill their child. It's a bunch of other things as well. But in terms of the precipitants or the things that kind of push that person over the edge, these are the kind of things that are likely to do that. So that's what we know from the research. It's always difficult not having evaluated or talked to somebody. I think, I feel relatively comfortable saying certainly the fact that this is somebody who murdered 3 children in front of the mother of those 3 children, made sure to do that, did not kill her, and very well could have. I don't think it's a big stretch to say clearly this person was sending a message to that parent and wants that parent to suffer. It's hard not to think that revenge is a motive in this case.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to see rumblings of discontent in the relationship, neighbors that are reporting what they perceive to be domestic violence going on in the home. And there are lots of people speculating out there. And again, we generally don't do that here until it comes out and is actually given by an authoritative source. But that has to be part of the consideration of what was the precipitating events. And if it was going on for months, we just saw in the Maya Miliete case, this is the woman in San Diego, in your neck of the woods, Dr. Johnston, where it was very clear that there was jealousy starting to be created and beliefs that there was infidelity, and then talks of divorce and things that led up, that start to give you reasons to think of a motive. Here, everybody's still scratching their head. What's the motive outside of I'm really mad at somebody in particular?
One thing I did want to comment on that you brought up, Mike, because I think it becomes very tricky, and this is this idea of premeditation. And I know, Adam, you were talking about it too, and I was really fascinated in what you were saying about what is required to show premeditation. Because here is somebody who allegedly has said that he's been planning this for a couple of months. And I really wonder what that means, because oftentimes, we allegedly also have the older daughter, the 14-year-old Alexis, again, this is what we're hearing, allegedly telling police that her mom told her stepdad a few months ago, if you keep drinking and you keep causing problems with the neighbors, I'm going to leave and divorce you. So there's this history of controlling behavior, apparently potential history of domestic violence. He has potentially made some statement along those lines. So what does that mean in terms of planning? Does that mean this person 3 months ago, when they had this, when she says this, he thinks in his head, before she leaves me, she's not taking the kids. So one way or the other, these kids are staying here. Is that what that means? That he began planning out how he's going to do it? Did it mean he made the decision that this happened and then they had an argument and that was a precipitant? And so there's the snap part of it, meaning that's what set lit the fuse, but this fire was burning for months ahead of time. So it'll be interesting to see, what that means going forward, because oftentimes the person has made a decision on some level that if this happens, if this person leaves me, if this person does this, I'm going to do this. But it's not necessarily that they're thinking, I'm going to get this gun, I'm going to do it on this date, I'm going to do it at this time in this way.
Yeah, it's interesting because the angle of revenge and then the prospect of divorce. I've seen that in cases that I've been on the defense side, where I've seen what I think probably everyone has had some experience with hearing about children that are sort of sadly used as pawns in a divorce setting, and this is the most extreme imaginable scenario for that. But I've certainly seen that. I've been on the defense side of cases where I'm convinced that the child's mother is making allegations against my client and using the children as a way to gain leverage and revenge in a divorce context. So it's certainly the most extreme imaginable way of doing that, but it certainly makes sense to me that would be the motive in this case.
Go ahead, Joni, please.
I just had a question, Adam, for you, because I did think that the whole issue of premeditation was really interesting. And I'm wondering, in Ohio, if premeditation, the fact that he killed 3 children and actually chased one child down. So let's just say that for a minute, for the sake of arguing, that he had not planned this ahead of time. The fact that he takes the time to, to kill one child, to chase another child down, and to kill a 3rd child, would that in and of itself be an argument for premeditation?
Yeah, it is. And so the language is actually prior calculation and design is the, which honestly, I think, I've had prosecutors like correct me. It's not premeditation, it's prior calculation and design. It's like, he should have kept stuck with premeditation, because I think that sounds less involved. But the reality is that the premeditation or the prior calculation component it can be momentary. It doesn't have to be this months of planning that we're hearing. And I would certainly, if I were the prosecutor, let's assume that, which is incredibly unlikely, but let's say that there's some defect in his confession that we've heard that he provided law enforcement. That would be exactly the argument that I would be making if I were the prosecutor. Look, we don't even need his confession. Look at the circumstances that he shot one, like lined these kids up, shot them one after another. That's light years away from unpremeditated murder, which is sort of like, the person is walking down the street and just on impulse, I'm going to kill somebody, So that is a very good point. And I think that would certainly be the argument that I would be making as the prosecutor, even without the evidence of a confession and months of planning that's apparently present here.
Wow. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to ask one other thing. And there's a saying we used a lot in the profiling circles, and I think is still kind of carried over into the Cold Case Foundation, Joni, and that is this Sunyupi Chi, or eyes see and ears hear what's already in the mind. This idea that we have to create it in our mind before we physically act it out. And that's always one of the things I go back to as an investigator, is that there's still this process that says, up here, I've justified it. I heard a psychologist the other day saying something to the effect of, words are just a practice session for acting out. So with that, maybe something we could leave everyone with, there's this idea of what are some of the red flags in these kinds of cases that maybe we should be thinking a little bit more about, making a call a little quicker, contacting Division of Family Services a little faster than our emotion wants to. What are your thoughts?
Well, I certainly think, and it is easy to play Monday morning quarterback, but certainly when we see any signs of abuse, in a family, in a neighbor or whatever, I think we should err on the side of caution and at least make some kind of phone call and say, this is what I'm seeing. These are my concerns. This is what I've seen. I think when we're in a relationship, I think, the red flags, we oftentimes are looking for, the person's collecting guns, which, these are obvious kind of signs, but oftentimes it's much more subtle than that. It's somebody who's controlling around money, controlling around behavior, controlling around what you do, who puts other people down all the time. It's somebody who has a bad temper. Is somebody who's lost control of their substance use, for example. It's the kind of thing where I feel like, it's easy to focus on red flags in terms of the last leakage, the last things that happen before it happens. But really, I think oftentimes, because rarely do we have cases like this. So if we're addressing issues in the relationship, if we're addressing the marital conflict, if we're addressing the verbal abuse and setting limits with that, getting help and support, and to deal with that and find a way to maybe leave safely or whatever. Those are the things I think we have to work on and do if we're in that relationship, making sure we have that support system. Somebody is helping us navigate that. The other thing is, if anybody is saying things like, you're never going to take these kids. I'll kill them before I let you leave. Now, I don't know, have any knowledge that that's been said here, but believe them. Take that seriously. It's much better to err on the side of caution than to wait and find out, call the person's bluff. But the main thing, like I said, is, as opposed to looking for something that's, a dramatic sign, sometimes it's too late when those signs come up. It's dealing with those issues that often go on for months or years that gradually or suddenly escalate, and something bad does happen. Really bad happens.
Yeah. Well, I cannot thank the two of you enough. It is late, Adam, for you. Joni,
God.
you still got a little bit of nighttime left, but I just want to give you both 30 seconds or 10 minutes. I'm going to give you your pulpit for closing arguments to just share any thoughts you have and maybe any hopes you have. When, I talk to the true crime community a lot about the fact that we can't just keep filling our buckets full of ugliness and not expect to become a little bit ugly, and that we got to be looking for more uplifting things, like maybe watching some puppy movies or something on YouTube once in a while. But Adam, if we could go to you, and then Joni to you, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like what Dr. Johnston was saying as far as the red flags, and the thing that I think what do we do with those red flags is really a challenging question, because there's so many situations like this where the neighbors apparently were aware that this person was a hothead, that he was demeaning and verbally abusive. At least that's the coverage that I've seen with his wife. And then what do you do under those circumstances? But I think one thing that we can encourage people to do, and even though I'm on the defense side, I have had people in my office who are clearly in those kind of maybe not to this extreme, but are in those circumstances where they're in an abusive relationship and they really need help getting out of that. And so there's, at least in Ohio, there's here in Columbus, there's a organization called Choices, which their whole mission is to help women in those circumstances where they're vulnerable to violence and abuse, and even in the most extreme cases of being murdered, that they can actually get the help that they need to get out of that relationship. And that can be one of the most dangerous times for, as I'm sure Dr. Johnston would agree with, for a woman that's in a relationship with an abuser to be able to get out of that. And that's, there's very few things that we can do to prevent a crime before it starts, but certainly recognizing the warning signs, and then trying to get the person that seems to be in some kind of jeopardy, the type of help that they would need to get out of those circumstances is really the best that we can do in a lot of cases.
Thank you. Dr. Johnson?
I guess two things came to mind for me. One is that, I think we do focus so much on the person who is in danger, because obviously that person's life could be, at risk, and their children as well. But I also think, as friends, if we have a friend who is, for whatever reason, struggling with a temper, that we see engaging in some behaviors like this, it's also important to talk to that person. Or we see somebody who seems to be struggling with substances or whatever. I think it is important to also, let that person know, hey, I'm concerned about you. This is what I'm seeing, and this is the impact I think it's having on your life. What's going on? This isn't a good thing for you. So I think that's very important to do.
Well, thank you. And thank you to both. I think we need to do this again. And I hope you both will join me again. Maybe we get to a couple of more hearings under our belt. We come back and visit this one and talk a little further. And my advice to everyone would be, as I always say, is kind of take all the information out on social media with a grain of salt. And let's wait for authoritative sources to step up with information. And as it comes out in court, then start to weigh that and become a sideline jurist as you try to figure out what's going on. But above all, remember, I don't think there are any winners in cases like this. And we got to hope that justice is served, and somehow these little boys are remembered in the right way. And so from all of us, to all of you. Want to say thanks from Profiling Evil. And again, please check down in the description. You can get Dr. Johnston's information, Adam Burke's information, and you'll be able to go to their websites. And if you need a lawyer, Adam's the one. If you need some help, Joni's the one. And if you want to just hang out, I'll come and be here on a regular basis. So from all of us at Profiling Evil, thanks. We'll see you soon at the next crime scene.